excellent revenge.
The phone rang at 7:30 p.m. while I was grilling burgers on my deck, watching the sun set over Lake Vermilion. When I saw Jessica's name on the caller ID, I should have let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, and she delivered the news that would turn my peaceful retirement upside down. "Victor, we need to talk about your lake house. My parents are moving in next week, just like that. No asking, no discussion, a demand dressed up as a statement of fact. I'm Victor Hayes, 58 years old, and I worked 33 years as a plant supervisor at Ford Motor Company in Detroit before I retired last year. Every overtime hour, every missed dinner, every weekend shift I pulled was so I could buy this place on Lake Vermilion in northern Minnesota. Cost me $155,000, every penny I'd saved for 3 decades. This wasn't just a house to me. It was proof that a guy who started on the factory floor could build something worth having. Jessica," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we talked about this. Your parents can visit, but they can't move in permanently. That's not going to work anymore." She shot back. "Their situation has changed. Harold lost his benefits and they lost their apartment. They need somewhere to stay while they get back on their feet." Harold Reynolds, Jessica's father, was 62 and had been struggling since he lost his pension benefits in some corporate restructuring mess. Dorothy, her mother, was 60 and hadn't worked since the kids were small. They'd been living in my son Leonard's spare bedroom for 4 months already, and now Jessica wanted to dump them on me. "There are apartments they can rent," I said. "There are programs for seniors who need housing assistance. Are you seriously going to let family end up on the street?" Her voice went sharp. Leonard already agreed. "If you have a problem with it, maybe you should sell that place and move back to Detroit where you can actually help your family instead of hiding out in the woods." The line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone, looking out at the lake where a family of loons was calling to each other across the water. 12 months earlier, my biggest concern was whether to stain the deck this weekend or wait until spring. Now I was apparently in a war I didn't know I'd signed up for. I called Leonard right away. My son answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, sharp and insistent. "Dad, hey look, Jessica told you about her parents, right? She told me they're moving into my house without my permission. That's what she told me." "Silence, then. It's temporary, Dad. Just until they find something permanent." "How temporary?" "A few months, maybe longer. Their situation is complicated. A few months." In my 3-bedroom cabin that I'd specifically bought to get away from other people's problems. A few months of Harold complaining about everything from the water pressure to the lack of cable TV. A few months of Dorothy rearranging my kitchen and leaving her romance novels all over my coffee table. "Leonard, son, I love you, but this isn't happening, Dad, please." Jessica's really stressed about this. Her parents don't have anywhere else to go, and things have been tight since her hours got cut at work. There it was, the tone I'd been hearing more and more since Leonard married Jessica 16 months ago. That defeated, exhausted sound of a man who'd stopped fighting battles he couldn't win. It reminded me of how I used to sound when his mother was alive and demanded I work extra shifts to pay for things we couldn't afford. But this was different. This was my house, bought with my money during my retirement. I'd earned the right to say no. The thing was, Leonard had always been a good kid. Smart, hardworking, decent to his core. He'd graduated from Michigan State with a business degree, got a solid job in marketing, and seemed to have his head screwed on straight. Then he met Jessica Reynolds at some work conference in Chicago, and within 6 months they were engaged. Within a year, they were married, and she was pregnant with demands I couldn't even keep track of. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs. The way she always had some crisis that required Leonard's immediate attention. The way she'd sweet-talk him into paying for things that weren't his responsibility. The way she'd gotten him to co-sign on a car loan for her brother, then acted surprised when the brother stopped making payments. But I'd kept my mouth shut, because that's what you do when your adult son makes his own choices. You hope he knows what he's doing, and you're there to pick up the pieces if things go wrong. I just hadn't expected the pieces to include my retirement home. The next morning, I drove the 2 hours south to Duluth and paid a visit to Diane Murphy, a private investigator I'd found online. Her office was in a strip mall between a tax prep place and a sandwich shop. She was about 50, no nonsense, with the kind of direct manner that told me she'd heard every sob story in the book. "Tell me about the family situation," she said, pulling out a legal pad. I laid it out for her: Jessica and Leonard's 16-month marriage, the Reynolds family's housing crisis, the 4 months they'd already been living in Leonard's apartment, Jessica's insistence that I house them indefinitely. What's your gut telling you? Diane asked, that there's more to this story than I'm being told. Jessica said Harold lost his benefits, but something about the timing doesn't add up. And the way she talks about money, always someone else's emergency that Leonard needs to fix. She nodded. There usually is more to it. I'll need a 1,500 retainer to start digging into their financial situation and housing history. I wrote the check on the spot. 33 years of plant supervision had taught me that when something doesn't smell right, you investigate before it becomes a bigger problem. At Ford, we'd had plenty of employees try to run scams on workers' compensation, disability claims, overtime fraud. I developed a nose for people who weren't telling the whole truth. While Diane did her work, I went about preparing my legal defenses. I called Carol Brennan, a family attorney in Duluth, who came recommended by my insurance agent. Carol was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, but she had the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of the female engineers who'd started joining Ford in the 1990s. Mr. Hayes, she said after I'd explained the situation, you have absolute legal right to refuse entry to anyone you choose. This is your property. Your daughter-in-law can demand all she wants, but she has no legal standing to force you to house her parents. What if they show up anyway? If they arrive uninvited and refuse to leave after you've asked them to go? That's trespassing. You call the sheriff. I hired her for a $2,000 retainer and felt better knowing I had professional backup. The investment hurt, minus $3,500 total between the lawyer and investigator. But it was cheaper than letting Jessica's family move in and never leave. The first attempt came the following Friday. I was sitting on my dock around noon when I saw a rental car coming up my gravel driveway. Harold and Dorothy Reynolds got out, along with enough luggage for a month-long stay. I met them on my front porch. Harold, Dorothy. This is unexpected. Harold stepped forward with his chest puffed out like a rooster. At 62, he still carried himself like he thought he was in charge of every room he entered. Jessica said you'd changed your mind about us staying here. Jessica was mistaken. You're not staying here. Dorothy clutched her purse tighter and looked around at my property with calculating eyes. We drove 3 hours from Detroit. We don't have anywhere else to go. There's a Holiday Inn in Grand Rapids, about 40 minutes south. Very comfortable. There's also a Best Western in Hibbing, if you prefer that direction. Harold's face went red. Now you listen here, Victor. We're family. Family takes care of family. Leonard told us you had plenty of room here. You're not my family, Harold. You're strangers who happen to be related to my daughter-in-law through marriage. Load your bags back in that car and find a motel. You can't be serious, Dorothy said, her voice getting shrill. We're Jessica's parents. We're practically your family too. Practically doesn't give you rights to my property. I'm asking you nicely to leave. Don't make me ask less nicely. They argued for another 15 minutes, with Harold trying various approaches, guilt, anger, wounded dignity, veiled threats about what Leonard would think. But I'd been dealing with difficult people for over 3 decades in plant management. I knew how to stand my ground without losing my temper. Eventually, they loaded their bags back in the rental car, Harold gunning the engine like a teenager having a tantrum as they drove away. The phone calls started that evening. Jessica, crying and yelling alternately, Leonard, pleading and frustrated, Harold, threatening legal action he couldn't afford and didn't have grounds for. I let most of them go to voicemail and saved the recordings. Carol had told me to document everything. Diane Murphy called me back the following Tuesday with her preliminary findings, and what she told me made my blood run cold. Mr. Hayes, your instincts were right. The Reynolds family lost their house to foreclosure 10 months ago, not recently. Harold didn't lose his benefits. He was laid off from his job at a parts supplier 2 years ago and burned through his 401k, trying to keep up mortgage payments. What else? Jessica has a gambling problem, online sports betting mostly. She's run up about $38,000 in credit card debt that your son doesn't know about. The family emergencies that required your son's money, they were covering minimum payments on Jessica's cards and funding her parents' lifestyle. My stomach dropped. How much has Leonard given them? $35,000 over the past 8 months, every time Jessica came up with a new crisis. Dorothy's medical bills that insurance supposedly wouldn't cover. Harold's car repairs after mysterious breakdowns. Emergency dental work for Jessica's sister. All fabricated. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair. $35,000. Money that should have been going toward Leonard's future. Maybe a down payment on a house of his own, stolen by his wife to fund her gambling addiction and her parents' freeloading lifestyle. There's more. Diane continued. Jessica was fired from her job 3 months ago for missing work, probably because she was staying home to place bets during business hours. She's been hiding that from Leonard too, pretending to go to work every day. She leaves the apartment in the morning and spends her days at coffee shops with Wi-Fi, gambling online. The complete picture hit me like a punch to the gut. My son wasn't just being manipulated, he was being systematically robbed by the woman he'd married. And now she wanted to expand her operation to include my lake house, probably so she could pressure me for money too, or worse, try to get some claim on my property. What's the timeline here? I asked. When did all this start? The serious gambling started about 8 months ago, right around when her parents moved in with them. Before that, it was smaller amounts, maybe a few hundred here and there. But having her parents there seems to have escalated everything. They kept encouraging her to ask Leonard for money, kept coming up with new emergencies. That aligned with what I'd been seeing in Leonard's behavior. 8 months ago, he'd been excited about his job, talking about saving for a house, planning for the future. Gradually, he'd become more stressed, more tired, more defeated. I'd chalked it up to normal marriage adjustments, but now I knew better. I called Leonard and asked him to drive up the following weekend. Just him, alone. I made it clear that Jessica wasn't welcome. Dad, I can't just leave Jessica home while I go visit you. She'll be upset. Son, Jessica is upset about a lot of things these days. One more won't kill her. I need to talk to you about something important, and I need to do it without her there trying to manage the conversation. He arrived Saturday afternoon looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His clothes hung loose on him. He'd lost weight. There were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas. We sat on my deck with beers, watching the water lap against my dock. Son, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. How much money have you given Jessica's parents in the past year? Leonard stared at his beer bottle for a long time. Why? Because I think you're being taken advantage of, and I want to help you figure out how bad it is. Dad, Jessica's parents are good people. They're just going through a rough patch. Harold's been out of work, and Dorothy has some health issues. How much money, Leonard? He was quiet for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. Maybe $20,000 for emergencies. I pulled out Diane's report and handed it to him. It's $35,000, and here's what those emergencies really paid for. I watched my son's face as he read through the bank records, the credit card statements, the employment verification that showed Jessica had been fired months ago. His hands started shaking about halfway through the first page. She lied to me, he said finally. About all of it. I'm sorry, son. I know this hurts. $35,000. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Dad, that was going to be our down payment. We were going to buy a house next spring. I've been working overtime, skipping lunches, driving my old car instead of getting something reliable because I thought we were saving for our future. I put my hand on his shoulder. What are you going to do? I don't know. I love her. But how do I trust someone who's been lying to me for months? And her parents, they knew. They had to know where the money was really going. He stayed the weekend. We didn't talk much more about Jessica or her parents Saturday night. We fished Sunday morning, cooked what we caught for lunch, sat on the dock watching eagles circle over the far shore. Father and son, things we hadn't done since he was in high school. When he left Sunday evening, he hugged me longer than usual. Thank you for telling me the truth, he said. I need to figure out what I'm going to do with it. 2 weeks later, Leonard called to tell me he'd confronted Jessica about everything. I showed her the investigator's report, he said. At first, she denied it all. Said you were trying to break us up because you never liked her. Then she admitted to the gambling, but claimed it was only a few $100s. When I showed her the bank records, she broke down crying and said she'd been trying to protect me from stress. What about her being fired? She said that was temporary, that she was going to tell me when she found another job. She begged me not to leave her, promised she'd get help for the gambling, said we could pay back the money over time. I didn't say anything. This was his decision to make, Dad. I wanted to believe her. Part of me still wants to believe her, but then her parents showed up at our apartment Sunday night. What happened? They were furious. Harold was yelling about how I was abandoning family, how Jessica needed support, not judgment. Dorothy was crying about how they'd end up homeless if I kicked them out. And Jessica, instead of backing me up, instead of telling them this was our problem to work out, she sided with them. She said if I couldn't handle supporting family, maybe I wasn't ready to be married. Leonard's voice cracked. That's when I knew it would never stop. Even if Jessica got help for the gambling, even if she found another job, her parents would always be there with the next emergency, the next crisis that required our money to solve. The breaking point came 3 days later. Jessica forged Leonard's signature on a loan application for $15,000, supposedly for debt consolidation. When the bank called to verify his employment and income, Leonard found out what she'd done. I confronted her that night, he told me. She said she was trying to fix everything, that the loan would pay off her credit cards and give us a fresh start. When I told her I was filing for divorce, she laughed. She actually laughed and said I'd never go through with it because I didn't have the backbone. Did you prove her wrong? I filed the papers the next morning. She's been calling me nonstop since then, alternating between begging me to come back and threatening to take half of everything I own. The divorce proceedings were messy, but straightforward. Jessica's attorney tried every angle he could think of. He argued Leonard owed Jessica compensation for supporting her family during their financial hardship. He claimed she deserved alimony because she'd been forced to leave her job due to stress from the marriage. He even suggested she had some claim to my lake house because they'd visited there as a married couple. Carol Brennan shut down every attempt with documentation and evidence. The financial records showed clearly who had taken money from whom. The employment records proved Jessica's deception about losing her job. The credit card statements revealed where the stolen money had actually gone. The bank records from the attempted loan fraud sealed the deal. Jessica ended up with her clothes, her car, and her debts. Leonard kept everything else, including what remained of his savings, about $8,000 after paying attorney fees and private investigator costs. The Reynolds family disappeared after the divorce was final. I heard through Leonard that they'd moved in with Dorothy's sister in Cleveland, probably to start the same scam with a new set of victims. Leonard took some time to put his life back together. He moved to a smaller apartment in Detroit, focused on his work, started seeing a counselor to work through the betrayal and manipulation he'd experienced. I drove down to visit him a couple times, and slowly I watched him become himself again, the confident, optimistic young man I'd raised. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Leonard told me he was thinking about relocating to Minnesota. There's a marketing position open in Duluth, he said. Better pay than what I'm making here, and I could be closer to you. What about starting over in a new place, Dad? I think starting over is exactly what I need. Detroit has too many memories of Jessica, too many reminders of how stupid I was to let her fool me for so long. He got the job and moved to Duluth that fall. We established a routine. He'd drive up to the lake most Friday evenings, fish with me Saturday morning, help with whatever maintenance projects I had going, grill whatever we'd caught for dinner. It was during one of those Friday evening visits that Leonard told me about Nancy Wilson, a woman he'd met at work. She was 38, divorced, with 2 teenage kids from her first marriage. I'm taking things really slow this time, Dad. We've been talking for a couple months, but I haven't even asked her out officially yet. What's she like? She's got her own apartment, pays her own bills, raises her kids without drama from her ex-husband. When I mentioned I was saving up for a house down payment, she didn't immediately start suggesting ways I could spend the money on other things. He smiled. Basically, she's the opposite of Jessica in every way that matters. I met Nancy the following month when Leonard brought her up for a weekend visit. She was quiet at first, polite but cautious. I didn't blame her. Meeting your boyfriend's father, who'd just been through a messy family situation, probably wasn't high on anyone's fun list, but she loosened up after I taught her how to clean walleye properly. She had good hands for detail work and didn't get squeamish about gutting fish. When she asked intelligent questions about my career at Ford and actually listened to the answers, I decided I liked her. Your dad's a good man. I overheard her tell Leonard that Saturday night while they sat on the dock. I can see where you get your work ethic and your integrity. He saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life, Leonard replied. If he hadn't hired that investigator, if he hadn't forced me to see what Jessica really was, I'd probably still be married to her, going broke one crisis at a time. Nancy's kids, Sarah and Mark, started coming with her on visits after Leonard and Nancy had been dating for about 6 months. Sarah was 16, smart and serious about school. Mark was 14, all elbows and attitude, but he perked up when I showed him how to operate my boat and let him drive it around the lake. Can I bring my friends up sometime? Mark asked one weekend. They've never been fishing on a real lake. As long as your mom says it's okay and you follow the safety rules, I told him. Later that evening, Nancy pulled me aside. Thank you for including my kids. Their father hasn't been much of a presence in their lives since the divorce. Having a positive male role model means more than you probably know. Leonard proposed to Nancy on my dock during a weekend visit the following spring. I was inside making coffee when I heard her squeal with delight. By the time I got outside, she was crying happy tears and showing me the ring, a modest diamond solitaire that Leonard had bought with money he'd saved himself, not borrowed from family. "We want to have the wedding here," Leonard told me later. "Small ceremony, just close friends and family. Nancy's parents, her kids, a few people from work. Would that be okay, son? I can't think of anything that would make me happier." The wedding was held the following September right here on my property. 45 people, a minister from Nancy's church in Duluth, and a reception on my deck overlooking the lake. Sarah and Mark stood up with Leonard and Nancy as the wedding party. Sarah cried during the ceremony. Mark tried to look bored, but kept grinning despite himself. I walked Nancy down the aisle since her own father had passed away 3 years earlier. When the minister asked who was giving her away, I said, "Her family and I are," and meant every word. During his toast at the reception, Leonard stood up and looked right at me. "2 years ago, I thought I knew what family meant," he said. "I thought it meant saying yes when people asked for help, even when that help was destroying my life. My father taught me something different. He showed me that real family protects each other from people who want to cause harm. Real family tells you the truth even when it hurts. Real family fights for each other when fighting is what's needed." He raised his beer bottle toward me. "Dad, thank you for loving me enough to save me from my own mistakes. And thank you for welcoming Nancy and her kids into our family the right way, with respect and honesty." Now, 2 years after all the drama started, I'm sitting on my dock again at sunset, watching the loons call to each other across the water. Leonard and Nancy live in a house they bought together in Duluth, a real partnership where both people contribute and both people benefit. Sarah is a senior in high school now, talking about college and maybe studying engineering like her step-grandfather. Mark plays hockey and helps me maintain the dock when they visit on weekends. I never heard from Jessica again. According to Leonard, she remarried quickly. Some guy she met online who had money and property she could access. I felt sorry for him, whoever he was. Maybe he'd be smarter than Leonard was initially. Maybe he'd see the warning signs earlier. The lake house is still mine, still my refuge and my reward for 33 years of hard work, but now it's something more. It's the place where my real family gathers. It's where Leonard and Nancy had their first dance as husband and wife. It's where Sarah caught her first northern pike and Mark learned to dock a boat properly. Most importantly, it's the place where I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is refuse to let them make bad decisions. Standing your ground isn't selfish when you're protecting people you care about from parasites who want to drain them dry. I finished my coffee and went inside to call Leonard, just to check in on how his week was going. Because that's what real family does. They stay connected without bleeding each other financially or emotionally. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Hey Dad, how's the lake tonight?" "Perfect, son. Absolutely perfect." And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was completely true. Sometimes protecting the people you love means disappointing them temporarily, because real love prioritizes their long-term well-being over short-term peace. A man who's worked 33 years for his security doesn't owe it to anyone, but he does owe his children the wisdom to recognize when they're being exploited.